Margaret Hale tore the legal notice in half on the courthouse steps, and every man in that Virginia square turned to stare at an unmarried woman doing something no one expected, refusing to break quietly. Her uncle had just told a magistrate she was unfit to raise her own brother and sister. He had smiled while he said it. She did not cry. She did not beg. She stood in the July heat with her sister's hand in hers and made a decision that would change everything. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The courthouse square in Rockford County, Virginia, smelled like dust and horse leather, and the particular kind of heat that pressed down on a July afternoon in 1817, as though the sky itself had grown tired of holding up. Margaret Hale had been standing on those steps for the better part of an hour, and she had not moved, not even when the crowd thinned and the magistrate's clerk locked the front door behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She was 25 years old. She had been managing her father's workshop accounts since she was 16. She had buried her mother at 19 and her father at 23, and had raised Samuel and Ruth on black coffee, stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to let the world see her stumble. She still had the legal notice in her hand. One half of it anyway. She had torn the other half without thinking, which was unusual for her because Margaret Hale did not do things without thinking. She planned. She calculated. She thought 3 steps ahead and then thought 3 more. But Walter Hale had stood in that courtroom with his hat in his hands and his voice full of performed regret, and he had told Magistrate Combs that his niece was an unmarried woman running a failing workshop with 2 minor children in her care, and the words had landed somewhere behind her sternum, where her composure usually lived. "The boy is 14 and running wild," Walter had said. "The girl is 9 and half wild herself. Margaret means well, God knows she does, but meaning well is not the same as providing. And the law, sir, recognizes that an unmarried woman cannot be the legal head of a household." He had looked at her when he said it. Not cruelly, which was the worst part. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided the value of and found wanting. Magistrate Combs had given her 30 days. 30 days to demonstrate that her household had stable legal protection, that Samuel and Ruth were properly supervised, and that the Hale workshop was not a liability. If she could not demonstrate those things, Walter would be granted temporary guardianship of the children. The workshop would fall under his management as their closest male relative, and Margaret would be removed from the property her parents had spent their lives building. Margaret. Ruth was beside her, her small hand tucked inside Margaret's. Ruth was 9, and she had her mother's dark eyes and the particular stillness of a child who understood more than adults assumed. She was looking up with an expression that Margaret recognized, that careful, controlled expression that meant Ruth was frightened and had decided not to show it because she had learned it from watching her sister. That expression nearly undid Margaret entirely. "We're going home," Margaret said. "What did the magistrate say?" "He said we have 30 days. "For what?" Margaret looked down at her. She thought about lying, or softening it, or finding some way to hand Ruth a version of the truth that weighed less. Then she thought about the kind of woman she was trying to raise. "To prove that we're going to be all right," Margaret said. "Which we are." Ruth considered this. "How?" Margaret opened her mouth, and that was the precise moment that the Mercer carriage stopped in front of the courthouse. It was unmistakable. The horses were matched blacks. The carriage itself was lacquered dark wood with brass fittings and the Mercer family crest. A river hawk with wings spread was painted on the door panel. Half the square stopped what it was doing. The Mercer name still carried that particular weight in Rockford County, the way any name does when it belongs to a man who owns the mill that grinds most of the county's grain and the timberland that supplies half its lumber, and the river transport contracts that move both. A servant climbed down from the driver's box. Young man livery pressed expression entirely neutral. He crossed the square with the deliberate pace of someone who had been told to appear unhurried, and he stopped in front of Margaret and held out a sealed envelope. "For Miss Margaret Hale," he said. "From Mr. Nathaniel Mercer." Margaret did not reach for it immediately. "I don't have any business with Mr. Mercer. I is aware of that, ma'am. He says to tell you the letter will explain itself." She took it. broke the wax seal, while Ruth watched with open curiosity, and Walter, who had appeared at the bottom of the courthouse steps, watched with something considerably less charitable. The letter was short. 6 sentences written in a firm, economical hand that did not waste space or sentiment. Miss Hale, I understand you are in need of a legally recognized household. I am in need of a wife who is practical, honest, and unlikely to be frightened by difficulty. I believe we share a mutual problem and may share a mutual solution. If you are willing to discuss terms, my carriage will take you to Mercer Hall this evening at 6 o'clock. No obligation attaches to the conversation. N. Mercer. Margaret read it twice. Walter was at her elbow before she finished the second reading. What does that say? She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Nothing that concerns you. Margaret. His voice dropped into that particular register he used when he wanted to sound like a concerned relative. Whatever he is offering you, you should know that Nathaniel Mercer is not capable of providing real stability. The man cannot leave his house without assistance. He is— I know what he is, Uncle Walter. Then you know that a marriage to a cripple is not— I said I know what he is. Her voice was entirely level. I also know what you are. And I know which one of you told the truth in that courtroom today. Walter's expression shifted. The performed concern slid just for a moment, and what replaced it was something colder. You're making a mistake. I make mistakes regularly, Margaret said. It's how I learn. Ruth, come along. She walked back to their wagon without turning around. Ruth's hand in hers, the letter in her pocket, and 30 days counting down behind her like a clock she could not stop. She did not tell Samuel until they were home. Samuel was 14 and had their father's jaw and their mother's temper and a fierce, aching desire to be treated as a man that Margaret tried to honor even when it complicated things. He was in the workshop when she arrived, fitting a handle onto a grain tool with the focused, slightly aggressive concentration he used when he was anxious about something he hadn't heard yet. How bad? He asked without looking up. Walter asked the magistrate for temporary guardianship. The fitting came down hard on the workbench. He can't. He is trying. He has 30 days to complete his case. Then we fight him. Samuel turned around. What can we do? There has to be something. I can work more hours. I can talk to the Harmon brothers about extending the contract. I can. Samuel. Don't tell me to calm down. I wasn't going to. Margaret sat down on the edge of the workbench. I received a marriage proposal today. The workshop went quiet. Ruth, who had followed Margaret in, looked between them with those careful dark eyes. From who? Samuel asked. Nathaniel Mercer. Another silence different in quality. The man in the chair, Samuel said finally. He uses a wheeled chair, yes. His carriage went over a creek embankment 2 years ago. His legs were injured severely. I know the story. Everyone knows the story. Samuel folded his arms. Why is he proposing to you? Because he needs a legal wife and I need a legal husband, and apparently he read the same newspaper we did this morning. She paused. I'm going to hear his terms this evening. I am not agreeing to anything until I understand what he wants and what he is offering. You're actually considering it. I'm considering keeping this family together, Margaret said. Which means I consider everything. Samuel looked at the workbench. He looked at Ruth. He looked at his sister with an expression that was trying very hard to be the composed face of a man and losing the battle by a small, painful margin. I don't want you to marry someone you don't know just because of us, he said. I know. Margaret reached over and pressed her hand briefly against his arm. But that is a very fine principle, and we can hold it up against the principle of Ruth being handed to Walter Hale and see which one bends first. Ruth said from the corner where she had been listening, I don't want to go to Uncle Walter's house. You're not going, Margaret said. Neither of you is going anywhere. That's what I'm going to make sure of. Mercer Hall was 4 miles from town, on a road that ran along the edge of the river, and Margaret drove herself there in the smaller wagon, because she was not going to arrive at a man's house in his own carriage before she had decided whether to enter into business with him. She arrived at 6 o'clock exactly as stated in the letter. The house was large and well-maintained, which surprised her. She had heard stories the way small counties generate stories about their most isolated residents, that Nathaniel Mercer had let the estate fall into neglect, that he rarely ate, that he had dismissed most of the servants. That grief and bitterness had turned him into something barely recognizable. What she found was a house with clean windows and well-swept steps, and a cook who met her at the door with professional courtesy and led her down a central hall to a library on the ground floor. She would learn later that the library was on the ground floor because Nathaniel refused to be carried upstairs in front of guests. At the time, she simply noted the location and the quality of the books and the particular way the room was arranged. Everything within arm's reach of the large desk. Nothing requiring him to cross to the far side of the room unnecessarily. She noticed things like that. Her father had taught her to read a room the way you read a ledger. Everything in it told you something about how the business was being run. Nathaniel Mercer looked like a man who had been built for physical size and had not entirely forgiven the world for what had happened to half of it. He was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that suggested he had been stubborn from birth. There were scars along one side of his face near his temple, and his right hand rested on the arm of his wheeled chair, with a stillness that looked deliberate. The stillness of someone who had learned to control what they could, because they could not control everything. He did not apologize for the chair. He did not look away from it. He simply looked at her. "Miss Hale," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Mercer." She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be offered it. "I read your letter." "I assumed you did." "Then I'll tell you that I don't respond well to vague proposals, so if you could be specific about what you want, I'll tell you whether it's possible." Something shifted in his expression. She could not tell if it was surprise or something else. "I need a wife," he said. "You mentioned that. I'd like to know why. My business partners, 3 men who hold contracts with this estate, have begun raising questions about my capacity to manage my affairs. 2 of them are considering transferring their contracts unless I can demonstrate that I have stable household leadership." A pause. A man alone in a chair who rarely leaves his estate does not inspire commercial confidence. "So it's a public-facing arrangement?" "Primarily." "And what do you know about my situation?" "I know that Walter Hale filed for temporary guardianship this morning. I know that you have a 14-year-old brother and a 9-year-old sister, and that you have been managing your father's workshop for the past 2 years. I know that the workshop has 2 outstanding debts that Walter has likely tried to use against you." He looked at her steadily. "I also know that you turned down 2 marriage proposals in the past year, which suggests that you are not looking for rescue. You are looking for a legal structure that lets you keep doing what you are already doing." Margaret studied him. "You've done considerable research." "I run a business, Miss Hale. I don't enter negotiations without information." "Then let me tell you what I require." She leaned forward slightly. "My brother and sister come to this house. They remain under my guardianship, not yours, not legally or in practice. The Hale workshop stays in Hale hands. No part of it becomes Mercer property, and no debt associated with it transfers to your accounts. I will manage your household, represent you publicly, and handle whatever domestic duties are reasonable. In exchange, the guardianship petition against me becomes legally untenable." She paused. "And I want to read every document that bears my name before I sign it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Those are your terms." "Those are my terms." "You didn't ask about money. I'm asking about legal protection. Money is a separate conversation for a separate day." Another pause, longer this time. "There is one additional condition I want to name before you agree." "Name it." "I will not claim affection from you, and I will not manufacture it myself. I am not asking you for a performance of happiness or devotion. I am asking for honesty and competence." His voice was steady, but she caught something underneath it, something that had been carefully placed there and then even more carefully buried. "After 1 year, if you find that this arrangement no longer serves you, I will ensure that you leave with enough to live independently. The children will remain legally yours." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. He was offering her an exit before they had even made an entrance. "What do you receive from this marriage," she said, "besides the appearance of control?" The question landed. She watched it land. His jaw tightened by a fraction. A witness, he said quietly. Who can say I still possess it? She held his gaze. That is an honest answer. I try to be. Then I have one question left. She folded her hands in her lap. Did you arrange the carriage accident 2 years ago? Did someone arrange it for you? Is there anything in this household that could place my family in danger that you are aware of and choosing not to tell me? The silence was very complete. No, Nathaniel said. I arranged nothing. I do not know what caused the accident, and there is nothing in this house I am hiding from you deliberately. He held her gaze the entire time. I cannot speak to what others may be hiding. I have begun to suspect I am missing information. That is part of why I want someone in this house who thinks clearly and asks inconvenient questions. Margaret nodded slowly. Then I'll accept your terms, she said, with mine attached. Agreed. She stood. He started to rise from the chair, caught himself, and she saw the single moment of humiliation that crossed his face before the controlled blankness returned. Mr. Mercer, she said. He looked at her. I did not come here expecting you to stand. She saw something in his face that she could not fully name, something that had not been there 30 seconds ago. They were married 10 days later at a small chapel 4 miles from Mercer Hall on a Saturday morning when the heat had broken briefly and left the air clean and pale gold. There was no celebration. There were 7 people present, the minister, his wife, Jonathan Price, who served as witness for Nathaniel Amos Reed's daughter, who served as witness for Margaret Samuel Ruth and Walter Hale, who arrived uninvited and sat in the last pew with the expression of a man watching a door close on something he had planned to walk through. Silas Mercer stood at the front of the chapel beside his nephew and beamed as though the occasion had been his personal achievement. He was 54, wide through the shoulders, with a politician's easy charm, and the kind of smile that arrived slightly before the emotion it was supposed to represent. You've brought light back to this family, he told Margaret afterward, pressing her hand between both of his. Nathaniel has been too alone for too long. I cannot tell you how relieved I am. Margaret thanked him and noted privately that he had not quite looked at Nathaniel when he said it. Dr. Josiah Crane arrived as they were leaving the chapel. He was 48 slight, with careful hands and a manner of speaking that placed each word precisely like a man who had learned long ago that impression was a form of currency. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and the name fit strangely against her ears. I want to say that Nathaniel's condition requires significant patience. He has good days and difficult ones, and what he needs most is consistency and calm. A pause. I've been with him 2 years. I know his case better than anyone. I look forward to learning from you, Margaret said pleasantly, and watched him nod and move away. Ruth tugged her sleeve. I don't like him, she whispered. Why? Margaret whispered back. He looks at Mr. Nathaniel like he's already decided what's going to happen to him. Margaret looked across the churchyard to where Nathaniel was speaking quietly with Jonathan Price. His back was to her. His chair was on the gravel path. That, she said quietly, is a very good observation. That night, after the household had settled and the candles had burned low, Nathaniel sent a servant to Margaret's room with a document. She read it at her writing table. It was everything he had promised her. Departure rights, the children's legal status, the workshop protections written out clearly in his careful hand. It also included a statement at the bottom that she had not requested. Nothing in this document constitutes a claim upon the person of my wife, her time, her affection, or her future intentions. It was, she understood, meant to give her freedom. It was also, she understood, the record of a man who expected to be abandoned and was getting ahead of it. She carried the document downstairs. She found Nathaniel in the library where he worked late most evenings, an oil lamp on the desk, a contract spread open in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and then at the document in her hand. Have you found something to revise? He asked. I have found something to remove. She folded the papers in half and walked to the fireplace and placed them on the grate. She did not hesitate, and she did not make a ceremony of it. He stared at the fire. Those documents took considerable effort to draft. I believe you. She turned around. I won't carry a paper that tells me neither of us is required to behave honorably. You protected my family. I will protect your name. What comes after that ought to be decided by what we actually do, not by what we agreed in advance not to expect." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. The controlled blankness was not entirely in place. Something underneath it was examining her with an attention she could feel. "That," he said finally, "is either very wise or very reckless." "Most things worth doing are both," Margaret said. She said goodnight and went back upstairs. And she almost missed it. Almost. She was halfway up the staircase when she heard Dr. Crane's voice from the hall below. The doctor had arrived for the evening visit, which apparently was a daily occurrence, and she paused on the stairs and heard the particular sound of a glass being set down on a tray. Then, because she was the woman who had kept her father's accounts and knew what a pattern looked like, she counted seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then she heard Nathaniel's voice, which had been steady and clear all evening, suddenly slow. Just slightly. Just enough to notice if you were listening for it. She stood on the staircase in the near dark and did not move. She had seen her father's hands after bad medicine. She knew what a tremor sounded like in a man's voice before it reached his hands. She turned and went back down the stairs. Dr. Crane was already gathering his coat. Nathaniel was at his desk with the lamp guttering low, and his right hand, the hand that had signed their marriage documents 4 hours ago, with perfect controlled steadiness, was pressed flat against the desk surface. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked. "He requires rest," Dr. Crane said not unkindly. "The day has been taxing. I've given him his evening preparation. He'll sleep well." "I'm sure," Margaret said. She looked at her husband. His eyes met hers across the room, and something in them, just for a moment, just beneath the exhaustion that was already pulling at him, was asking a question he did not know how to ask out loud. She held his gaze. "Good night, Mr. Mercer," she said. "I'll see you in the morning." She walked back upstairs. She sat down at her writing table and opened the small journal she kept for accounts. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote the date. Below it, she wrote the time. Below that, she wrote, "Hand steady before. Unsteady after. Speech slowed. 10 minutes post-tonic." She stared at what she had written for a long time. Then she dipped her pen and wrote one more line. "Begin again tomorrow. Watch everything." Margaret did not sleep well that first night at Mercer Hall, and she had learned long ago that insomnia was her body's way of telling her something her mind had not yet organized into words. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man's hand pressed flat against a desk, and she thought about the particular quality of Dr. Crane's voice when he said he requires rest, not concerned, not worried, but settled the way a man sounds when things are proceeding according to plan. She was up before dawn. She found the kitchen without asking for directions, which pleased the cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Hattie, who had been at Mercer Hall for 19 years, and who regarded Margaret's early appearance with the cautious approval of someone who had watched too many strangers come through a household and leave it worse than they found it. "You want coffee?" Hattie said. It was not a question. "Please." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. "And I want to ask you something." Hattie set a cup down and waited. "When does Mr. Mercer take his morning tonic, before breakfast or after?" "After. Dr. Crane leaves it prepared the night before in a green bottle on the library sideboard. Mr. Mercer takes it with his first meal, usually around 8. And the evening preparation that's delivered by the doctor in person. Most evenings, yes." Hattie was quiet for a moment. "You're already paying attention." "I paid attention to ledgers for 9 years, Margaret said. "It's a habit." Hattie poured herself a cup and sat down across the table, which was either a significant gesture of acceptance or simply a woman who had been on her feet since 4 in the morning and needed to sit. Margaret suspected both. "How was better?" Hattie said without preamble. "Before the accident. Not just in the legs, anyone can understand that part. But after the accident, after Dr. Crane started the treatments, something else changed. He started losing the thread of conversations. He'd sign papers and forget he'd signed them. Some mornings he'd sit at that desk, and by noon he hadn't written a word, just stared." She looked at her cup. He used to run this estate like a clock. Now half the decisions go through Mr. Silas, because Mr. Nathaniel says he can't hold the numbers in his head long enough. Margaret kept her voice even. And before the tonic on mornings when he missed a dose. Hattie looked at her directly. You're quick. I'm trying to understand the household. There was one morning, Hattie said slowly, 3 months back. Dr. Crane was delayed 2 days due to flooding. Mr. Nathaniel missed both the morning and evening preparations. Second day he called me into the library and dictated 12 letters in under 2 hours. Remembered figures from contracts he hadn't reviewed in 6 months. A pause. The day Crane came back by evening he was slow again. Couldn't finish his supper. Margaret turned her coffee cup in her hands. She did not write anything down. She was filing it date circumstance pattern in the part of her mind where she kept information that was not yet evidence, but was moving in that direction. Thank you, she said. I didn't say anything, Hattie said, and stood and went back to the stove. Nathaniel was in the library at 7:30 before his tonic, and Margaret understood immediately what Hattie had meant. He was working. Not the careful, deliberate work of a man managing limited energy, but the fast-focused work of someone who had been at it since first light, and had covered the desk in papers and found 3 discrepancies in a supply invoice, and was in the middle of annotating a mill contract with precise, impatient handwriting. He looked up when she entered, and the look on his face was open in a way it hadn't been the night before. Alert, sharp, alive in a way that made her understand viscerally what 2 years of slow poisoning had been taking from him. You're up early, he said. So are you. She sat down across from him without being invited, which she had decided was going to be her standard approach. What did you find? He looked at the invoice. For a half-second, she thought he was going to tell her it was estate business and not her concern, and she was already deciding how to respond to that when he turned the paper around and slid it across the desk. Timber delivery, he said. This invoice claims 40 cords delivered to the South Mill last month. My ledger from the month before shows the same mill received 38 cords, and that was considered a high month. Either someone is overcharging or someone is inflating delivery numbers to cover money that isn't arriving. Margaret looked at the invoice. She looked at the column of numbers he had circled. Who manages the supply accounts? Silas. He took over estate management 18 months ago when I was... He stopped. When my concentration was unreliable. She handed the invoice back. Can you pull the invoices from the previous 6 months? I can. They're in the West office. A pause. Which Silas keeps locked. She looked at him. He looked at her. How long has it been locked? She asked. Since last spring. And the key? Silas carries it. Margaret thought about this for a moment. Is there a second key? There was. It should be on the household keyring which hangs in the butler's pantry. He paused. I haven't checked in some time. I'll check this morning, she said simply. He watched her. There was something in his face that was not quite surprise, more like a man recalibrating a calculation he'd been running wrong. You're not going to tell me to let it alone. Why would I do that? Because most people who enter this household do. His voice was even, but she heard it the edge underneath the 2 years of isolation, dressed up as restraint. It's easier to accept that Silas is managing things competently than to ask why the West office is locked. I'm not interested in easier, Margaret said. I'm interested in accurate. The door opened, and a young servant carried in the breakfast tray. And behind him, precisely on schedule, came the green bottle on a small silver salver. Margaret watched Nathaniel's hands pick up the glass. She watched him drink, and she watched with her eyes steady and her face entirely neutral, the way the sharpness in his face began slowly, subtly, over the next quarter hour, to dull at the edges, like a lamp being turned down by degrees. He did not notice it happening. She understood then that he never noticed it happening. It was gradual enough and consistent enough that he had probably concluded this was simply who he was now. A man who thought clearly in the early morning and faded by noon. That conclusion, she decided, was exactly what someone wanted him to reach. Samuel found his footing in Mercer Hall faster than Margaret had anticipated, and it complicated her relief with something close to worry, because Samuel finding his footing somewhere new usually meant he was either very comfortable or very determined, and both states required monitoring. He had located Nathaniel's collection of mechanical drawings on the second day and had been working up the courage to ask about them ever since. Margaret knew this because Ruth had told her with the specific informational generosity of a younger sibling who had learned exactly which intelligence would be most useful to trade. She watched it happen from across the library doorway. On the fourth morning, Samuel standing with one of the rolled drawings spread carefully on the edge of the desk, pointing to something with the concentrated seriousness he reserved for things that genuinely interested him. "This gear ratio," Samuel said. "Is it for the mill wheel or the press mechanism?" Nathaniel did not look up immediately. He had the manner of a man who had not expected to be asked a real question by a 14-year-old and was deciding how to respond to it. "Mill wheel," he said finally. "The press uses a different system. Come around here and I'll show you." Samuel came around the desk, and Nathaniel pulled a second drawing from the stack, and the next hour, Margaret did not see either of them because they had fallen into that particular male silence. That is not silence at all, but a different language entirely conducted in technical vocabulary, and the occasional disagreement about measurements. She found Ruth in the hallway outside. "He's happy," Ruth said quietly, looking at the closed library door. "He's interested," Margaret said. "It's the same thing for Samuel." Ruth thought about this. "Is Mr. Nathaniel going to be Samuel's friend?" "I don't know yet." Margaret looked at the door. "But Samuel needs someone to teach him about business, and Mr. Nathaniel needs someone to remind him that his mind still works." She took Ruth's hand. "Come help me count the household keys." The second key to the West office was missing. The key ring in the butler's pantry had 17 keys on it, each one labeled in faded ink on small paper tabs. The tab that read West Office Mercer had nothing attached to it. The ring itself bore the slightly stretched look of a hook that had recently held more weight. The butler, a composed man named Everett, who had been with the household for 12 years, told her that he had noticed the key gone approximately 6 weeks ago and had assumed Mr. Silas had consolidated the office keys for management purposes. "Did you ask him about it?" Margaret said. "No, ma'am." Everett's expression was entirely professional. "Mr. Silas manages the estate operations. It wasn't my place to question the key arrangement." "I see." She looked at the empty hook. "Thank you, Everett." She walked back through the hall and stopped outside the West office door. She did not try the handle. She stood there for a moment and looked at the door, which told her nothing beyond the fact that it was locked, and thought about the 12 letters Nathaniel had dictated in 2 hours, and the 40 cords of timber that might not exist, and the way Silas Mercer smiled at his nephew as though he were something already decided. Then she went to find Nathaniel and tell him about the key. He was alone by then, the mill drawings rolled back up, Samuel gone to find Ruth. He listened to her without interrupting, which she had come to understand in 4 days was his default mode when someone was telling him something that mattered. "He took the key," Nathaniel said. "It appears so. That means he knows I might start looking." His jaw was set. "Or it means he's always known I might eventually look, and he prepared for it in advance." "The second," Margaret said. "A man who plans the way he plans doesn't take a key reactively. He takes it before it becomes necessary." Nathaniel was quiet. She could see him working through it, the sequence of steps, the calculation of who knew what and when, and she recognized the quality of that thinking. It was the same quality she had heard in his voice at 7:30 in the morning before the tonic. Sharp, fast, organized. "We can't confront him directly," Nathaniel said. "Not yet. If he knows we're suspicious, he'll move whatever is in that office before we can get to it." "Agreed." She sat down across from him. "Then we work from the outside. I'll compare supply invoices from the household accounts against delivery records from the mill workers. If Blue Ridge Trading is padding invoices, the discrepancy will show in the numbers." "Blue Ridge Trading." He looked at her. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found it in the workshop debts," she said. "The company purchased several of Walter's unpaid notes against the Hale workshop." The same company name appears in the Mercer supply invoices I reviewed yesterday. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had more weight. Walter's debts, Nathaniel said slowly, are being funded through a company that is also drawing money from this estate. That's what the paper trail suggests. He looked at her for a long moment. Your uncle and my uncle, he said, are not operating independently, she said. No. She watched him absorb this, the full scope of it, the particular ugliness of two men arranging their respective cruelties through a shared financial instrument, and she saw his expression move through something she recognized. Not surprise. Not even anger exactly. The specific exhausted devastation of a person discovering that something they trusted was rotten all the way through. I want the mill invoices, he said. The ones from the workers directly, not the ones that came through Silas. I'll get them. She stood. But Nathaniel. He looked up. Don't change how you behave with Silas. Don't let him see anything different. We need him to believe he's still in control. He held her gaze. You're asking me to sit across a table from a man I increasingly believe arranged my accident and act as though I trust him. Yes, she said. Can you? The question hung in the air between them. She did not soften it, and she did not take it back because the answer actually mattered. I've been doing it for 2 years, Nathaniel said quietly. The only difference now is that I'll know I'm doing it. That evening, Silas came to dinner. He came most evenings, which was its own particular piece of information. He lived in the guest house on the estate's eastern edge, close enough to make the dinner habit feel familial, far enough to maintain the appearance of giving the newlyweds space. He brought a bottle of cordial he insisted on pouring for Nathaniel himself, a sweet amber liquid he said was good for inflammation in the joints. Margaret watched Nathaniel take the glass. She watched him raise it, and then without any visible change in expression, she saw Nathaniel set the glass aside and reach for the water pitcher and say something to Silas about the Southfield yield that required Silas to turn in his chair, and in that moment, Margaret palmed the cordial glass and replaced it with one from her own place setting, already half drunk. Nathaniel did not look at her when he did it. She did not look at him. They had not discussed it. She did not know when he had decided to stop trusting the cordial. She only knew that somewhere between this morning and this evening, they had crossed from two people in a practical arrangement into two people who watched each other's backs. Silas turned back and smiled, and told Nathaniel to drink up that the cordial did more good than Dr. Crane's tonics. I'm sure it does, Nathaniel said pleasantly. Later after. Silas had gone, and the house was settling into night sounds. Margaret found herself in the hallway outside the library. She did not go in. She simply stood there for a moment and thought about a 14-year-old with milled drawings and a 9-year-old with their mother's eyes, and a man who had spent 2 years being slowly unmade and did not yet know all the ways it had been done to him. Then she went to her room and opened her journal and wrote down every number she remembered from the supply invoices and fell asleep with the pen still in her hand. 3 weeks into the marriage, the thunderstorm came. It built through the afternoon and broke at 11 o'clock at night, the kind of summer storm that doesn't arrive gently, but drops onto a house like something thrown. Margaret was still awake at her writing table when she heard it first. The rain, then the wind, and then cutting through both a sound from the library below that was not quite a voice and not quite silence. She went downstairs without stopping for a lamp. Nathaniel was at his desk. He was gripping the armrests of his chair with both hands, and his breathing was wrong, shallow and fast, the kind of breathing she associated with pain, except that his eyes were open and fixed on something that wasn't in the room. She understood in the first 5 seconds that he was not hurt. He was somewhere else. Somewhere a road went over an embankment, and a carriage wheel broke, and a man lost the part of his life he had believed was the permanent part. She did not cross to him. She did not touch him without permission. She had 4 younger cousins, and she had learned young that the worst thing you could do for a person trapped in their own memory was to reach for them before they knew where they were. She sat down in the chair across the desk, far enough away that he was not cornered, close enough that he knew she was there. "The library," she said. Her voice was completely even. "There's a lamp on your desk and one on the mantel. The rain is coming from the east, which means the big window is keeping it out. Samuel left his surveying book on the table this afternoon. He drew in the margins, which you would find irritating if you weren't wherever you are right now. A pause. Ruth's hair ribbon is beside the chessboard. Blue. She keeps leaving it there because she knows you won't move it. His breathing changed, slowed by a fraction. "You're in the library," she said quietly. "It is the 14th of August, 1817, and you are in your library, and everything in this room is exactly where it was this morning." Another long moment. Then his hands released the armrests, and he exhaled the way a man does when he has been holding a breath he didn't know he was holding. She did not say anything else. She sat with him while the rain kept going, and she did not ask if he was all right because she could see he wasn't, and she did not fill the space with reassurances because he was not the kind of man who wanted things he knew to be untrue. Eventually he said, "I apologize." "For what?" "For that." "That was a storm and a bad memory," Margaret said. "You don't owe me an apology for either one." I was quiet for a moment. "I hear it sometimes. Before the carriage went over. Another horse on the road, I can hear it coming up behind us, but I can't see it. I never see it." He stopped. "I've tried to tell myself I imagined it. That the accident was the axle and bad road conditions the way the report said." "But you don't believe the report," she said. "I believe I heard a second horse." She looked at her hands. "If you heard a second horse, then someone was on that road with you. And if someone was on that road with you at that time of night on that road specifically, then the accident may not have been an accident," Nathaniel said. "Yes, I know." "Have you told anyone else?" "No. Not Jonathan. Not Jonathan." He paused. "I thought if I said it out loud, and there was no evidence, I would simply be the injured man inventing reasons why his injury wasn't his own fault. I didn't want to be that man." "That man would be telling the truth," Margaret said. "Those are two different things." He looked at her across the dark room. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. "You are," he said slowly, "not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I'm not entirely certain. Someone more focused on the arrangement." "I am focused on the arrangement," she said. "The arrangement includes keeping you alive, which means I need to know everything relevant to that objective." He almost smiled. She was beginning to learn the specific expression, not the full thing, but the near thing, the way the corner of his mouth moved when something landed on him, and he was deciding whether to let it show. "I remembered something else," he said. "The invoice from the mill. 3 months before the accident, there was a repair order placed for my carriage. Routine maintenance. I signed it. I didn't examine it closely because the coachman handled the maintenance, and I trusted him." "You think the repair order was altered?" "I think someone may have used a routine repair order to arrange something that wasn't routine." He looked at her. "I don't have the paperwork. It would have gone through Silas." "Then we need to find someone who was there before Silas," Margaret said. "Someone who saw the original records." "Amos Reed," Nathaniel said. "He was head bookkeeper for this estate for 23 years. He was encouraged to retire about 6 months after the accident." A pause. "Silas told me Amos had asked for it. I never questioned it." "Where is he now?" "He has a small house on the county road north of town. His son works in the East Mill office." Nathaniel's voice was careful. "Under Silas." Margaret understood the implication immediately. "His son's position is the leverage." "Almost certainly." "Then we need to remove the leverage," she said. "Is there another position for his son in one of your other operations somewhere Silas doesn't have direct authority?" Nathaniel thought. "There's the Harmon Valley Mill. It's 12 miles out. Silas has no foothold there because it's newer purchased after the accident and managed through Jonathan's office." "Then we transfer the son," Margaret said. Quietly. "Legitimate promotion, legitimate reason. And then we talk to Amos." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for some time." "I've been watching the pattern," she said. The pattern has been waiting for this conversation. Outside, the storm broke entirely, and the sudden quiet was enormous. The way quiet always sounds larger after a great deal of noise. "I should let you sleep," Margaret said and stood. "Margaret." He said her name without the formal prefix for the first time, and she paused. "Thank you. For being here instead of upstairs." She looked at him. He was not being sentimental. He was being precise, which was how he expressed things that actually moved him. "We're on the same side," she said simply, and went upstairs. She sat at her writing table and opened her journal and wrote, 2 years of deliberate diminishment. Second horse witness needed. Amos Reed, the key to before. Remove the sun from Silas's reach. Move carefully. Silas must not know we're moving at all. Then she wrote in smaller letters beneath. He said my name tonight. It sounded like he'd decided something. She stared at that last line for a moment, and then closed the journal and did not think about it further, which was not entirely successful. Amos Reed answered his door on the third knock, and he was not surprised to see Margaret. She had come alone in the smaller wagon on the pretense of asking about old land boundaries near the Hale workshop, a pretense thin enough that Amos saw through it before she finished the sentence. But he let her finish it anyway, which she took as an encouraging sign. How was 67? A small, compact man, with the kind of stillness that accumulates in a person after decades of watching other people make decisions with other people's money. His house was precise and ordered every object in its place, the habits of a bookkeeper translated into domestic architecture. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." She sat at his kitchen table and watched him move around the room and said nothing until he sat down across from her, and then she said, "Blue Ridge Trading." The coffee cup stopped moving. He looked at her. He did not look frightened exactly. He looked like a man who had been waiting a specific amount of time for a specific conversation to arrive and was now calculating whether the moment was safe enough to have it. "Who told you that name?" he said. "No one told me. I found it in 2 separate account books." She held his gaze. "It appears in Walter Hale's debt records and in the Mercer Supply invoices. The same company. Receiving payments from both directions." Amos set his cup down. He was quiet for a long time. "You need to understand something," he said finally. "Some information is dangerous because it proves theft. That's one kind of dangerous." He folded his hands on the table. "Some information is dangerous because it proves who was supposed to die. That is a different kind of dangerous altogether." The kitchen was very quiet. "The carriage," Margaret said. He didn't answer directly. He looked at his folded hands. "I kept duplicate entries," he said. "When I started seeing the anomalies, the false companies, the inflated invoices, money moving to places it had no business moving, I kept copies. Not because I was brave. Because I was a bookkeeper, and a bookkeeper who destroys evidence is just a criminal with better handwriting." "Where are the copies?" "Sealed, in a storage chest at the old Riordan warehouse. South of the river road, the one they stopped using after the flood." He looked at her. "I was going to give them to Nathaniel, and then the accident happened, and then my son started working under Silas." He stopped. "You know how that ends." "Not anymore," Margaret said. "By Friday your son will have a position at the Harmon Valley Mill, under Jonathan Price's administration. Silas Mercer will have no authority over him there." Amos looked at her for a long time. He was assessing her the way an experienced man assesses an unexpected offer, looking for the part that costs him something he hasn't priced yet. "Your husband arranged this," he said. "We arranged it together." Something shifted in Amos's expression. Not quite relief. The specific look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just seen a second pair of hands. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she confirmed. She stood to leave, and he said without looking up from the table, "There's a repair invoice for Mr. Nathaniel's carriage, dated 3 days before the accident. I copied it." A pause. "The original will have been altered. Mine won't." Margaret kept her voice level. "What does the original say?" "It says Mr. Nathaniel authorized the replacement of the main axle pin with a standard component." Amos finally looked at her. "My copy says what was actually ordered. A component rated for light loads. Put it in a carriage carrying 2 men on a steep road, and it holds maybe an hour before it shears." The room was very still. "And the authorization signature?" Margaret asked. "Nathaniel's name," Amos said. "Not Nathaniel's hand. She drove back to Mercer Hall in the early afternoon heat, with her hands steady on the reins, and her mind working through everything Amos had said, laying it against everything she already knew, fitting the shapes together into the picture that had been assembling itself since she first watched a man's hands tremble 20 minutes after taking medicine he trusted. She told Nathaniel that evening in the library, with the door closed and the household sounds muffled by distance. He listened without interrupting. He had a particular quality of stillness when he was receiving information that mattered, not passive, but concentrated, the way a man listens when he is simultaneously processing and deciding. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He paid to have me killed," Nathaniel said. "And when the accident wasn't enough, he paid a doctor to finish what the road started." His voice was flat, not without emotion. Flat the way a surface is flat when something very heavy has been placed on it and the weight hasn't moved. "That appears to be what the evidence suggests," Margaret said carefully. "My uncle." He looked at the desk. "I gave him authority over this estate because I could not manage it myself. Because the medicine made me, because I couldn't hold the numbers. Because I trusted him." He stopped. "He built the cage and sold me the idea that I'd built it myself." "Nathaniel." He looked at her. "We're going to get the duplicates from the warehouse. Jonathan is going tomorrow at first light before Silas can do anything to—" She stopped, because she saw it cross his face. A flicker, just one, the specific expression of a man whose mind has arrived somewhere 3 steps ahead of the conversation. And then he said quietly, "Silas will know by tomorrow. He'll know because I told him tonight." She stared at him. "I told him," Nathaniel said, "that Amos had mentioned to me years ago that he kept a personal archive of estate records. I told him I might ask Amos to bring them to the house for the sake of efficiency." He met her eyes. "I watched his face when I said it." "What did you see?" "A man deciding something," Nathaniel said. Very fast and very quietly. He paused. "Jonathan needs to go tonight, not tomorrow." Margaret was already standing. "I'll send word." She was at the door when he said, "Margaret." She turned. "Be careful how you move through this house tonight. If Silas has someone watching." "I know," she said. "I'll be careful." She was not careful enough. Or rather, she was perfectly careful, and it did not matter, because some traps are not set for careless people. They are set for people who are paying attention and moving fast, which is precisely the moment when a fire becomes most useful. Jonathan rode out before midnight. He found the Reardon warehouse by the riverbank, and he found the storage chest, and he found the sealed documents inside it, and he was on his horse with them before the fire started. The fire started at the east end of the building, and it moved fast. The way fires move when they have been arranged to move fast. And by the time it reached the chest's location, there was nothing left to burn there, because Jonathan had already gone. He arrived back at Mercer Hall at 2 in the morning and found Nathaniel waiting, and he spread the documents on the desk, and Nathaniel looked at them by lamplight, and then went very still. He reached for the carriage repair invoice. The duplicate Amos had kept. He read the numbers and the component specifications and the date 3 days before the accident. 3 days before a road and a bad axle pin and a second horse on a night road. And then he looked at the signature at the bottom of the order authorization. He looked at it for a long time. "That is not my handwriting," he said. His voice was very quiet and very clear, and it carried the particular quality of a thing said aloud for the first time that has been true in a man's body for 2 years, without ever having been spoken. Jonathan said nothing. Margaret said nothing. The lamp made the only sound in the room, the small flutter of a flame in still air. Nathaniel set the paper down. "They burned the warehouse," he said, "and we already had everything that was in it." He looked at Jonathan. "That means they don't know we moved fast enough." A pause. "Good. Let them believe the fire accomplished something." He looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. In the morning, Silas would come to breakfast and smile and pour the cordial, and believe that the night had gone in his favor. Dr. Crane would arrive with the green bottle, and believe that Nathaniel Mercer was still the diminished, confused, dependent man he had spent 2 years constructing. Neither of them would know that the man sitting in that library had just read his own forged death warrant and had decided with the quiet precision of someone who had finally stopped being grateful for the cage exactly what he intended to do about it. 3 days after the warehouse burned, Silas came to breakfast and smiled as though the world were proceeding exactly as he had arranged it. He poured the cordial himself, the way he always did, and set it beside Nathaniel's plate with the particular attentiveness of a man who had confused control for care so long that he no longer noticed the difference. He talked about the Southfield yield and the mill contracts and a county road committee. He intended to support, and Nathaniel listened and nodded and said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments. And Margaret sat across the table and watched her husband perform trust in a man who had forged his signature on a death warrant. She had not slept more than 3 hours. She did not let it show. What she had done in those hours between Jonathan's return and the dawn was make a list. Not on paper could be found, but in the organized architecture of her mind, where she had been keeping accounts since she was 16 years old. Evidence secured. Evidence still needed. Witnesses who could speak. Witnesses who were afraid to. Leverage held against them. Leverage that could be removed. The list was long. They were not ready. That was the truth she had to sit with over breakfast while Silas refilled his own coffee and asked after the children. "Samuel is well," Margaret said. "He has been spending time with the mechanical drawings." "Wonderful boy," Silas said warmly. "He has his father's look about him, I'm told." Margaret smiled and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who was complimenting a child he had helped make an orphan's bargaining chip. She picked up her coffee cup and held it, and breathed slowly, and thought about 30 days counting down, and an Amos Reed duplicate invoice, and a forged signature on a repair order, and she thought not yet, but soon, across the table. Nathaniel raised the cordial glass to his lips. She watched him tip it back. She watched Silas watch him do it with the satisfied expression of a man whose arrangements are intact. What Silas did not see because he was not looking at the right thing was that Nathaniel's throat did not move. The accusation arrived on a Thursday, which was afterwards the day Margaret associated with the specific feeling of a floor dropping away beneath your feet while you are standing perfectly still. It had been building for a week, though she had not seen all of it assembling. Dr. Crane had been almost theatrically attentive, visiting twice daily, instead of once asking detailed questions about Nathaniel's meals and sleep, recording observations with the practiced concern of a man constructing a record he intended to produce later. She had noticed it. She had not understood the full purpose of it until Thursday. The supper had been unremarkable. Nathaniel ate well better than he had in the 3 weeks before he had quietly, carefully stopped swallowing the tonic, and he was in good humor. Engaged asking Samuel about a surveying problem the boy had been working on. Ruth had fallen asleep in her chair before dessert, which was a thing she did sometimes, and Nathaniel had told Hattie to carry her up without waking her. And there had been something in his voice when he said it. The casual ownership of a man who has accepted that these children are his household's children, that Margaret had filed away in the private part of her ledger. Then Nathaniel set down his fork. He pressed his hand flat against the table. His face changed. He started, and then he didn't finish, and his head dropped forward, and Margaret was out of her chair before Samuel could even react. She caught his shoulder. His skin was clammy. His breathing was wrong, the shallow, fast pattern she had come to know too well. "Nathaniel, can you hear me?" "Something is..." His voice came out thick and confused. "Something is wrong." She looked at the food. She looked at the water pitcher. She looked at the small glass of cordial Silas had pressed on him before dinner, insisting it would help with the joint pain, and which Nathaniel had appeared to drink, and had in fact poured into a potted plant by the window when Silas turned to greet a servant. He hadn't drunk it. She had watched him not drink it, which meant something else had been the vehicle tonight. She had time to think exactly that much before the front door opened, and Dr. Crane walked in without knocking, which was the moment she understood the entire evening had been planned. He was followed by 2 men she didn't recognize, and behind them came Walter Hale, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had received an anonymous warning and ridden hard to act on it. "What happened?" Crane said, moving to Nathaniel with the authority of a physician in his element. "He collapsed at dinner," Margaret said. She kept her voice steady because her voice was the one thing she could control with certainty. Something is wrong with his... Step back, Mrs. Mercer. She did not step back. I am his wife. I will not... Step back. Crane's voice was not unkind. It was certain in the way that things are certain when they have been scripted in advance. He knelt beside Nathaniel and pressed 2 fingers to his wrist and looked at his pupils and made sounds of grave professional concern. Then he stood and looked at the men he had brought with him. The household needs to be examined. Walter stepped forward. I received word this evening, he said to the room at large, to the 2 men who turned out to be a county officer and a court-appointed witness, that my niece has been administering improper substances to her husband in order to gain control of his affairs. I came immediately. The county officer, a man named Gates, who Margaret had seen twice at the courthouse, was already moving toward the kitchen. The court witness began writing in a small ledger. Crane was explaining Nathaniel's symptoms in the detailed, sorrowful vocabulary of a man who had been cataloging them for precisely this purpose. Margaret stood in the center of the room and watched it happen and did not move, because the one thing she understood with absolute clarity in that moment was that any wrong movement would be used against her. Then Gates came back from the direction of the east hallway. He was carrying her sewing chest. Her actual sewing chest, the one Ruth had helped her unpack on the first day, the one that had lived on the window seat in her sitting room for 6 weeks. He opened it on the sideboard. Inside, wrapped in a piece of brown paper she had never seen before, was a small packet of white powder. This was found, Gates said, in Mrs. Mercer's personal sewing chest, in her private sitting room. The room was very quiet. Margaret looked at the packet. She looked at the brown paper. She looked at the exact placement of it nestled between her thread spools and her thimble and Ruth's half-finished embroidery. Someone had taken the chest apart and put it back together with care, which meant someone had done it with time, which meant someone who had access to her rooms. She looked at Crane's face and saw the thing Ruth had identified weeks ago, that settled quality of a man who has already decided what is going to happen to someone. I have never seen that packet, Margaret said. That is, of course, what she would say, Walter offered with a sorrow so practiced it had become indistinguishable from the genuine article. Crane addressed Gates directly. Nathaniel's symptoms tonight are consistent with a substance that, administered in small doses over time, produces weakness and confusion, and in a larger dose causes the kind of acute episode we witnessed this evening. He paused for precisely the right amount of time. Mrs. Mercer has had exclusive access to his meals for the past 6 weeks. She has also been asking questions about his medical treatment that go considerably beyond a wife's ordinary interest. She has been trying to help him, Samuel said sharply. He had been standing against the far wall since the men entered with the clenched stillness of a boy who understood he was not permitted to do what he wanted to do in this moment. She has been watching his symptoms because she was worried. Samuel. Margaret's voice was quiet. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had to work not to flinch from, the specific helpless fury of someone watching an injustice unfold, and understanding. They cannot stop it with honesty alone. Gates turned to Nathaniel. He had recovered enough to be upright in his chair, though his color was poor and his hands were unsteady, and he was clearly tracking the conversation through a veil of whatever had been put in his food tonight. Mr. Mercer, Gates said with the awkward formality of a man doing something he is not entirely comfortable with. In your view, is there cause to detain your wife pending examination of the evidence? Every person in the room waited. Margaret looked at her husband. He looked terrible. He was gray-faced and shaking, and he had clearly been poisoned genuinely tonight with something she had not been able to prevent because she had not known the vector, and she understood that what he said in the next 10 seconds would define everything that came after. He looked at the powder on the sideboard. He looked at Walter. He looked at Crane. He looked at Gates. Then he looked at his wife. My wife, Nathaniel said, did not poison me. Crane moved immediately. Sir, your current condition may be affecting your... Dr. Crane. Nathaniel's voice, though hoarse and slow with whatever was in his system, carried the specific authority of a man who has owned a county mill for 12 years and knows what his voice is supposed to do when he uses it fully. You have treated my legs for 2 years. My capacity for judgment was not located in my legs. Crane stopped. My wife did not poison me, Nathaniel repeated to Gates directly. I want that recorded by your witness. Gates recorded it. He also, because he was a man who understood legal reality, even when he didn't enjoy it, explained that the physical evidence was sufficient to require a temporary order, regardless of Nathaniel's statement. It was not an arrest. It was a supervised residence arrangement. Margaret would remain within the estate, but would be removed from Nathaniel's medical care. He also said, and this was the part that cost her the most, that Samuel and Ruth would be remanded to Walter Hale's care pending the outcome of the hearing. Samuel said no. Just that. One word, flat and absolute. Margaret crossed the room and stood in front of him and put both hands on his shoulders, and he was shaking with fury. Not fear, which told her he was all right, which told her he would stay all right. And she looked at him until his eyes came to hers. Listen to me, she said quietly. You are going to go with Ruth. You are going to keep her calm. You are going to remember every single thing you see and hear in Walter's house. You are going to be exactly the person I have watched you become for the past 2 years. She squeezed his shoulders. Can you do that? He looked at her. His jaw was tight. I don't want to leave you. You're not leaving me. You're doing your part. She held his gaze. Samuel, can you do that? A long moment. Then he straightened under her hands. Yes, he said. The east wing of Mercer Hall was comfortable and well-furnished, and served as her supervised residence in the way that a locked door serves as a reminder that comfort is not the same as freedom. Margaret had her writing table and her journal, and the view from the window, and the daily visit from Everett, who brought meals and never said more than was necessary, and whose careful neutrality she had begun to read as its own form of loyalty. She did not waste time being angry. Anger was a fire that burned fuel she needed for other things. She thought about the powder in the sewing chest. She thought about who had placed it there and when and how, and she worked backward through every day she had spent in this house and every time her sitting room had been unattended. She narrowed the window to 4 days, the 4 days before Thursday, when Crane had doubled his visits and the household's routines had shifted in small ways she had noticed, but not yet connected. Then she thought about the powder itself. Its color. Its smell, which she had caught for just a moment in the chaos of that room, a faint medicinal sharpness beneath the paper wrapping. She knew that smell. She had learned it 6 weeks ago, standing in Nathaniel's library the morning after their wedding, watching a green bottle placed on a silver salver. She opened her journal. She wrote powder same source as tonic. Crane's supply. Not something Walter obtained independently. This was planted with Crane's material, which means Crane controls the evidence against me, which means the evidence can be traced back to him. She underlined the last line. She was not helpless. She was separated from Nathaniel, and from the children, and from the investigation, and that was serious and real, but she had her mind, and she had 6 weeks of meticulous notes, and she had the specific, unflappable stubbornness of a woman who had buried 2 parents and raised 2 children, and told a county magistrate to his face that she was not going to break quietly. She was not going to break quietly. She was on her 3rd page of notes when the knock came. Not the door, the window. 2 sharp taps low on the glass. She opened it. Samuel was outside in the dark, slightly out of breath from whatever route he had taken to reach the east wing without being seen. Walter's house is 2 miles, she said. How did you? I told Ruth I was going to the outhouse and climbed out the back window, he said, with the particular matter-of-fact confidence of a 14-year-old who has calculated a risk and decided it was acceptable. I can't stay long. I have to tell you something. She stepped back from the window. Tell me. Walter had a visitor tonight, after we arrived. A man I didn't recognize. Older, big shoulders, rides a bay horse. He went into Walter's study, and they were in there an hour. But before the door closed, I heard Walter say. Samuel paused, getting the words exactly right the way she had taught him. Silas says the hearing has been moved up. 4 days. Margaret felt the floor shift. 4 days. And then he said, if she signs before the panel convenes, we won't need the panel. I don't know what that means. She knew what it meant. A private panel physicians and magistrates handpicked could declare her mentally unfit without a full county hearing. If she signed documents first, surrendering guardianship, and whatever else they wanted, the panel became unnecessary because there would be nothing left to contest. 4 days. To sign or to be declared incompetent. Those were the choices Silas was offering her. Go back, she told Samuel. The same way you came. Do not let Walter know you left. And Samuel, she held his gaze through the window. Do not tell Ruth. Let her sleep well for a few more nights. What are you going to do? I'm going to figure out how to talk to your father, she said, and then stopped because she had said your father without thinking, and it was not accurate. Nathaniel was not Samuel's father. He was her husband of 6 weeks, and yet Samuel did not flinch at it, did not correct it, just nodded with the steady seriousness of a boy who had decided something on his own timetable and was not advertising it. He disappeared back into the dark. Margaret sat at her writing table and thought about 4 days and a panel that Silas had already built, and a document she was not going to sign, and a husband who was on the other side of a locked wing of his own house. And she thought, we need to move faster than they are moving. We need to move now. Nathaniel had come to the same conclusion from the other side of the house. He had spent 2 days being visibly unwell, which required less performance than it might have because whatever had been in his food Thursday evening was still working its way out of his system and receiving Dr. Crane's attentive care with the patient resignation of a man who had accepted his circumstances. He had told Jonathan in a quiet conversation conducted through the mechanism of a chess game and the natural drift of pieces on a board, everything he needed to communicate. Jonathan had listened with the practiced neutrality of a man who had conducted legal strategy in considerably less comfortable settings. The mechanism was simple. Nathaniel still had authority in this house, technical and legal authority, the kind that a temporary care order did not supersede. He could not override the order confining Margaret to the East Wing. He could not countermand Gates's custody arrangement for the children. But he could still sign documents. He could still communicate with his own lawyer. He could still summon people to his estate on matters of legitimate business. He had told Silas 3 days ago that a second copy of the estate ledgers existed in the old mill office. A complete set, he had said with a confused and slightly helpless expression, because I had Amos keep a backup in case I ever needed to review figures when the main office was locked. He had watched Silas's face absorb this. He had watched the calculation happen. He had watched Silas excuse himself from the room with a smoothness that would have been admirable if it hadn't been heading toward whatever man he intended to send to destroy what he believed was evidence. Jonathan had been following that man since before Silas finished his excuse. Jonathan had documented 3 names. One of them was the same man Samuel had seen arriving at Walter's house on Thursday night. The trap had worked. They had 3 names, and those 3 names connected Silas's operation to Walter's, and that connection was the thread that pulled correctly would unravel both. What Nathaniel had not anticipated, what neither of them had anticipated, was the 4-day timeline. He learned it from Everett, who delivered the information embedded in a conversation about household accounts, with the careful indirection of a man who understood that some intelligence could only travel sideways. The panel was convening. The documents were prepared. The objective was not simply to discredit Margaret, but to remove her legally permanently in a way that would leave Nathaniel isolated and dependent, and without the one person in this house who had been restoring him to himself one morning at a time. He told Jonathan that evening. They had perhaps 60 hours. Jonathan said, "The county sheriff is Gordon Platt. He's honest. He owes you a debt from the mill fire 3 years ago when you rebuilt the Halverson family's home without making them pay for it. He'll listen if the evidence is sufficient." "The evidence is sufficient," Nathaniel said. "Amos Reed is the witness. He's clear of Silas now. He'll testify." "And Dr. Crane?" Nathaniel thought about this. "Crane is afraid. He made decisions out of debt and fear, and that kind of man will confess if he believes his alternative is worse." He paused. "Let him know quietly that we have the supply records, the batch records for the tonic, that the second physician has identified the substance. Give him the choice between a prison charge and a testimony." Jonathan looked at him for a moment. "You've been running this from your chair this whole time." "I had very little else to do," Nathaniel said, and there was something dry and sharp in his voice that Jonathan recognized as the man he had known before the accident, the one who had built a county mill operation from a disputed land grant and 4 employees, the one who had never required assistance thinking his way through a problem. "I need to reach Margaret," Nathaniel said. "Not through a servant, directly." "The East Wing shares a wall with the library," Jonathan said after a moment. "The library fireplace and the East sitting room fireplace share a flue. Sound carries." Nathaniel looked at his lawyer for a long moment. "You've tested this." "I have been staying in the East guest room since Thursday," Jonathan said, "which shares a wall with the East sitting room. Yes." That night, Margaret sat beside the fireplace in the East sitting room and listened. She had not known what she was listening for. She had been sitting there because it was the warmest part of the room, and she was cold, in the way that fear sometimes produces cold, a physical symptom of a mental state. Then she heard it faint, slightly distorted by the distance and the flue, but unmistakably his voice. He was not shouting. He was speaking at the precise volume of a man who had tested the distance and knew how much was required. "Margaret." A pause. "If you can hear me, knock once on the stone." She reached out and knocked once on the hearthstone. A long moment of nothing, and then, "Jonathan tells me you have 4 days. We have 60 hours. Here is what I need you to do." She pulled her journal onto her knees and held her pen ready and listened. He told her about the 3 names. He told her about Crane's supply records. He told her about Sheriff Platt, who was honest, and what Jonathan was going to present to him, and when. He told her that Amos Reed was prepared to testify that his son was safely transferred, that the warehouse documents were secured in Jonathan's office in town. Then he said, "The cordial, the one Silas brings. I kept every glass I didn't drink. I have 6 weeks of samples. Jonathan has taken them to the second physician. The physician is preparing a report." She closed her eyes for one moment. 6 weeks of samples. He had been doing it since before she knew to ask him to, which meant he had begun suspecting on his own, long before their late-night conversations, long before she had described the morning sharpness and the afternoon fade. She knocked twice on the stone, which they had not established as a code, but he seemed to understand it as acknowledgement. "One more thing," he said, and his voice changed. Not the strategic voice, not the operational voice, but something underneath those. The voice she had first heard during a thunderstorm when she sat several feet away and named the things in the room to bring him back. "When this is over, when you are out of that wing and the children are back, and Silas and Crane and Walter are in front of a magistrate who will not be one of Silas's chosen men, I want to have a conversation with you that has nothing to do with any of this." She sat with her hand against the warm stone. "Knock once if you'll have that conversation with me," he said. She knocked once. The fireplace was quiet. She sat with her journal on her knees and looked at the list of names and the 60 hours and the evidence assembling itself from every direction into something that was finally going to be enough. And she thought about a man in a chair in a library, running an investigation with a lawyer and a retired bookkeeper and a 14-year-old who climbed out windows, and she thought about the way he had said a witness who can say, "I still possess it." On the first night she had met him, and how the word witness had turned out to mean something considerably larger than either of them had negotiated. The plan moved on the second day. Jonathan rode to Sheriff Platt at first light and laid the evidence on his desk and did not leave until the sheriff agreed to come. Amos Reed arrived at the sheriff's office at 9 in the morning and said everything he had held for 2 years into the official record with the precise documented detail of a man who had been keeping it organized since the day he copied the first anomalous entry. The second physician submitted his report. 3 county clerks confirmed signature discrepancies on Mercer documents compared against verified samples of Nathaniel's actual hand. Crane cracked at 11 o'clock when Jonathan placed the supply batch records in front of him and named the specific statute that applied to medical conspiracy. He was not a brave man. He had never been a brave man. He was a frightened man who had made escalating choices in a direction he had always known was wrong, and the relief on his face when Jonathan offered him the witness agreement was, Margaret was told later, almost pitiable. She did not know most of this in the moment it happened. She knew it later in pieces assembled from Jonathan's account and Samuel's and Nathaniel's, and finally from Amos Reed himself. What she knew in the moment was that on the second afternoon, the door to the east wing opened, and it was not Everett with a meal tray. It was Silas. He was alone. He was composed in the way that men are composed when they have assessed their position and decided that negotiation is the only remaining option, which is a different composure from confidence. She recognized it because she had seen it on Walter's face once years ago when he had come to her father's workshop asking for money and had known before he knocked that he was going to be refused. He sat down across from her at the writing table. He looked at her journal, which was closed, and at her hands, which were folded, and at her face, which she kept entirely neutral. "I want you to understand something," he said. "This does not have to be as difficult as it is becoming." "That's an interesting opening," Margaret said. "The panel convenes tomorrow, you know that." He reached into his coat and placed two documents on the table between them. "These are simpler. The first confirms that Nathaniel's decisions over the past 6 weeks have been made under improper influence and require review by an estate trustee, that trustee being myself, which is a formality, simply restoring what existed before your arrival. The second transfers guardianship of the minor children to Walter Hale permanently with a provision for their welfare that I think you'll find reasonable." She looked at the documents. She did not touch them. "And if I sign both," she said, "the panel doesn't convene." "Correct. And the poisoning accusation?" "Quietly set aside. A misunderstanding." She looked at him. He was watching her with the patient expression of a man who had sat across many tables and was accustomed to waiting for people to calculate their way to the conclusion he had already reached. "Tell me something," she said. "When you arranged the axle pin, the one on Nathaniel's carriage 3 days before the accident, did you intend to be at the funeral, or were you going to be called away on business?" The room went very still. Silas's expression did not collapse. She gave him credit for that. It shifted something moving underneath the composed surface, something that briefly surfaced and then was put back down by an act of will. "That is a remarkable accusation. It is a question," she said. "You haven't answered it." "I don't intend to answer it." His voice was colder now. The negotiating warmth had been set aside. "You are a merchant's daughter from a county workshop who stumbled into this household through a legal technicality and has spent 6 weeks convincing herself she understands something she does not. Sign the documents, Mrs. Mercer." "No," Margaret said. "The panel will declare you mentally unstable." "The panel," she said, "is welcome to try." He stood. He was a large man, and he used his size in the way that large men sometimes do when words have not produced the desired result. Not threatening precisely, but allowing the physical fact of himself to make an argument the words had failed to make. "You are making a very serious mistake." "You made one mistake," Margaret said. She kept her voice completely even. "You believed that because I was responsible for people I loved, I could be frightened into abandoning them. Responsibility is not fear, Mr. Mercer. It is the opposite. It is the reason I learned a very long time ago not to surrender." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway. She sat very still for a count of 10. Then she opened her journal and wrote down every word he had said in the order he had said it, because a man who has just revealed that he knows about the axle pin has just confessed to something, and she intended that confession to exist somewhere in writing before the day was over. She had barely finished the last line when she heard the front door of the hall open. Not Silas Ving, he had already gone, but multiple people arriving. The particular sound of several sets of footsteps, with the purposeful rhythm of people who have been sent somewhere official. Then she heard Nathaniel's voice carrying from the main hall, with the clear, full authority she had first heard him use on Gates, and which she understood now was not a performance. It was simply who he was, returned to himself. "Sheriff Platt," Nathaniel said. "Thank you for coming. I believe you have everything you need. Let me introduce you to Amos Reed, who has been waiting to speak with you for 2 years." Margaret put down her pen. She looked at the door. Then she heard the key turn in the lock from the outside. Not Silas's lock, not the temporary care order, but the household master key, the one that superseded all the others, and the door opened, and Nathaniel was in the doorway. Jonathan Price standing behind him, and behind Jonathan was Sheriff Platt with 2 deputies, and behind all of them, slightly breathless, and with the particular brightness of someone who has been running and is not remotely sorry about it, was Samuel. Nathaniel looked at her. She looked at him. He was gray-tired and still not fully himself from whatever Thursday's supper had contained, and he was in his chair with his hands on the wheels, and there was nothing triumphant in his expression, nothing theatrical, just a man who had done what was necessary from the position he had and had arrived where he meant to arrive. "I'm sorry it took 2 days," he said. "You're exactly on time," Margaret said. She stood and walked to him and looked past him at Jonathan and the sheriff and her brother and the long corridor that led back to the main hall, where Silas Mercer was about to discover that every arrangement he had made had just been unmade. "Let's finish this," she said. Silas Mercer was in the main hall when they reached him, and he was not alone. He had 2 men with him. The same broad-shouldered man Samuel had seen at Walter's house, and a younger one, Margaret didn't recognize, and he was in the process of giving instructions in a low, urgent voice that stopped the moment he saw Sheriff Platt come through the doorway behind Nathaniel's chair. The calculation on his face happened fast. She watched it happen. Watched him assess the sheriff, the 2 deputies, Jonathan Price with a leather satchel that was clearly full of documents, Amos Reed standing beside Jonathan with the composed stillness of a man who has decided to stop being afraid. Watched Silas add it up and arrive at the sum, and then, because he was the kind of man who had always been able to find a second door when the first one closed, arrange his face into something that resembled dignified concern. "Gordon," he said to the sheriff, "I'm glad you're here. There's been a serious situation developing in this household, and I've been trying to manage it without causing unnecessary alarm." "Mr. Mercer," Platt said, and he meant Nathaniel, not Silas, which was itself a statement. He was 50 thick through the chest, with the unhurried manner of a man who had stopped being impressed by social positioning sometime around his 30th year. "Your lawyer has presented me with a considerable amount of documentation. I'd like to go through it here with everyone present. Is there a room?" "The library," Nathaniel said. Silas said, "I think it would be more appropriate to conduct this through proper county channels with adequate time for all parties too." "Mr. Silas Mercer," Platt said, "you are welcome to accompany us to the library, or you are welcome to wait in the hall under my deputy's supervision. Those are your choices at present." Silas went to the library. They arranged themselves around the room, the way people arrange themselves when something important and irreversible is about to happen. Platt at the desk, Jonathan to his left, Amos Reed in the chair Margaret had sat in on her first evening in this house. Nathaniel positioned himself at the end of the desk, and Margaret stood beside him, and Samuel was in the doorway, because no one had told him to leave, and he had made himself quiet enough that no one thought to. Silas stood near the fireplace. His 2 men had been politely but unambiguously separated from him by Platt's deputies and were waiting in the hall. He still had the composed expression, but it was working harder now. Jonathan opened the satchel. "I'll start with the financial documentation," he said, with the brisk precision of a man who had organized this particular sequence carefully and intended to proceed through it without detour. "Blue Ridge Trading, registered in Richmond, July 1815. The registered owner of record is a man named Clement Foster, who is upon inspection a former clerk in the Mercer estate office, who left employment here in June 1815. He placed a document on the desk. Mr. Foster, when located last week, confirmed that he signed the registration papers as directed by Silas Mercer and has had no substantive involvement with the company since. The company's operating decisions and banking arrangements have been managed entirely by Mr. Silas Mercer." Platt looked at the document. He looked at Silas. "Mr. Mercer, do you have a response to that?" "Foster is a disgruntled former employee," Silas said. "His testimony is—" "We have the banking records," Jonathan said. He placed another document on the desk. "Blue Ridge Trading received payments from Mercer Estate supply accounts totaling approximately $9,400 over 18 months. In the same period, Blue Ridge Trading made payments to 2 individuals." He paused. "Walter Hale in exchange for filing a guardianship petition against Margaret Hale, and Dr. Josiah Crane in exchange for services I'll address separately." The room was quiet. Amos Reed folded his hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man listening to a story he already knows the ending of. "Walter Hale is not present," Platt said. "He will be," Jonathan said. "I have a deputy at his house as of this morning." Silas said, "This is a fabrication. The supply accounts represent legitimate." "The supply accounts," Amos Reed said, and his voice was quiet and dry, and carried the particular authority of a man who had kept numbers for 23 years, and had never once made an error. He didn't find and correct himself. "Do not match the delivery records from the mills." He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers. "I made duplicate entries of every anomalous transaction beginning in the spring of 1815. The originals, which I expected to be altered, are here in their altered form." He placed one set on the desk. "My duplicates show what the numbers actually were before the alterations." He placed the second set beside the first. "The difference between those two columns, Sheriff, is where the $9,400 went." Platt picked up both documents and looked at them side by side. He was not an accountant, but he was a man who had been doing his job long enough to recognize the shape of fraud when it was laid out clearly in front of him. He looked at Silas. Silas was looking at Amos Reed with an expression that was no longer composed. It was the face of a man who had believed a particular door was sealed and had just watched it open. "You retired," Silas said. The social performance had slipped enough to let the actual voice through cold, sharp, stripped of the warmth he deployed like a tool. "I was told you." "You were told what you needed to believe," Amos said. "I have been keeping accounts my whole life, Mr. Silas. I know how to keep them in more than one place." Jonathan moved to the carriage documents, and this was the moment Nathaniel had been carrying in his chest for 2 years, the moment he had not let himself fully imagine, because imagining it required believing it was possible, and he had spent a considerable amount of that time being made to believe very little was possible. Jonathan placed the carriage repair invoice on the desk. The original obtained from the county records office where Silas had filed it 2 years ago as part of the accident documentation. And beside it, Amos Reed's duplicate, the copy, made before the alteration, showing what had actually been ordered. "The original invoice," Jonathan said, "shows a standard axle pin replacement authorized by Nathaniel Mercer. The copy made before alteration shows that what was actually ordered and installed was a component rated for light load capacity, insufficient for a loaded carriage on a grade road under normal conditions, and near certain to fail within 1 to 3 hours of use." Platt looked at both invoices. He looked at the signatures. "These are both signed by Nathaniel Mercer." "One of them is," Jonathan said. He produced a third document, 3 pages of side-by-side signature comparisons, prepared by a clerk from the county land office, who had 17 years of document examination experience. "This is a verified comparison of Mr. Nathaniel Mercer's authentic signature across 47 documents over 8 years against the signature on the original invoice. The assessment prepared independently is that the invoice signature is not genuine." Platt held the comparison pages for a long time. Nathaniel had not looked at Silas during any of this. He had been looking at the desk, at the documents, at the numbered columns that represented 2 years of his life being taken from him in increments, small enough that he had not recognized them as theft, until someone with a merchant's eye for accounts had sat across from him and started asking inconvenient questions. Now he looked at Silas. Silas was looking back at him. The composed expression was entirely gone. What was underneath it was something Margaret had not seen on him before. Not guilt, which would have required a different kind of man, but the specific look of someone recalculating rapidly whether any remaining option exists. "You were my father's brother," Nathaniel said. His voice was even and quiet, and it cost him something to keep it that way. She could see it cost him, but he kept it anyway. "You held me in the church when I was baptized. My father trusted you with this estate because you were family." Silas said nothing. "Did you arrange the accident?" Nathaniel said. "Or did you simply take advantage of it after it happened?" Another silence. Platt did not interrupt it. "Neither," Silas said. "This documentation is Clement Foster's testimony," Jonathan said, "includes a specific reference to a conversation in June 1815, in which Mr. Silas Mercer discussed the carriage maintenance schedule and expressed interest in which component suppliers handled axle repairs. He paused. This was 6 weeks before the accident. Silas's mouth closed. There was a second horse, Nathaniel said. On the road that night, I heard it come up behind the carriage. I have heard it every night for 2 years. He held Silas's gaze. Was that you? The room held its breath. Silas looked away first. It was not a confession in any legal sense. It was a man's eyes moving away from something he could not look at directly, and every person in that room understood what it meant, and Platt wrote something in his ledger, and Margaret kept her hands folded in front of her and breathed slowly. Dr. Crane arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by one of Platt's men. He looked diminished. That was the only word for it. In this house he had always carried the particular authority of the person who possesses information no one else has, and now the information had left him, and what remained was a thin, frightened man in a good coat who could not look at Nathaniel when he entered the room. Jonathan did not need to present the evidence against him at length. Crane had already signed the witness agreement. He had already confirmed in Jonathan's office the previous afternoon the composition of the tonic, the purpose of the alterations, the source of the substance found in Margaret's sewing chest. What he had not yet done was say it aloud in this room in front of Nathaniel. Platt asked him to confirm his statement. Crane looked at his hands. The morning tonic administered to Mr. Nathaniel Mercer contained, in addition to standard analgesic compounds, a substance that in regular doses produces fatigue, cognitive slowing tremor, and loss of appetite. His voice was a physician's voice, precise, technical, using the language of the profession, like a shield between himself and what the language described. The substance was introduced at Mr. Silas Mercer's direction, beginning approximately 4 months after the carriage accident, when it became apparent that Mr. Nathaniel Mercer was recovering mental clarity sufficient to resume estate management. The room was very still. The packet found in Mrs. Mercer's sewing chest, Crane continued, and now his voice was quieter, the technical precision eroding slightly at the edges, came from my medical supply. It was placed there by a servant acting on instructions communicated through Mr. Silas Mercer's household. He stopped. I did not place it myself. I was told it was necessary to discredit her because she had identified the pattern in Mr. Nathaniel's symptoms. Nathaniel said in a voice that was entirely controlled and entirely cold, "How much of my recovery is real without the tonic, without whatever else you were administering? How much of the limitation I have lived with for 2 years is the injury, and how much is what you gave me?" Crane looked at him for the first time since entering the room. It was not a comfortable look to witness. "The original injury was severe," he said. "The nerve damage to your lower legs is genuine and significant. You would have needed considerable rehabilitation regardless." He paused. "But the fatigue, the cognitive episodes, the tremors, the inability to concentrate for more than an hour, the loss of appetite and strength." He stopped again. "Those were not the injury, those were the treatment." The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Nathaniel looked at the desk. He looked at his hands steadier now than they had been in 2 years, because he had been not swallowing the tonic for 3 weeks, but still not what they had been before. He looked at something that was not in the room. Margaret did not reach for him. She stood beside him, and she was present, and she let him have the moment without filling it, because some things need to be felt fully before they can be carried forward. Then he looked up. "Thank you for your honesty, doctor," he said. "It comes late, but it comes." Crane nodded. He could not seem to find words for the specific response that situation required, which was perhaps appropriate. Walter arrived under deputy escort at 11:30, and he arrived angry, which was his default response to situations he had not controlled the entrance of. "This is outrageous," he said before he was fully through the door. "I received word from Sheriff Platt's office, and I came willingly, which is more than—" "Sit down, Mr. Hale," Platt said. Walter sat down, but he did it with the aggressive energy of a man demonstrating that he was choosing to sit, not being made to. He looked at Margaret, and his expression moved through a series of rapid adjustments, surprise at seeing her out of the East Wing recalculation, and then the performance of aggrieved concern, that she had watched him deploy in the courtroom 8 weeks ago. "Margaret, I want you to know that everything I did was out of genuine worry for those children. The payments from Blue Ridge Trading," Jonathan said, placing the banking document in front of Walter, "total $460 over 8 weeks. The first payment was made 3 days after you filed the guardianship petition." He looked at Walter steadily. "Would you like to explain the nature of the services those payments represent?" Walter looked at the document. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Silas, which was the involuntary glance toward the person who had assured him this would work. Silas was looking at the wall. "Those payments," Walter said carefully, "were for legitimate consulting services related to—" "Samuel," Margaret said. Samuel straightened in the doorway. "Tell Sheriff Platt what Walter asked you to do." Samuel walked into the room. He stood in front of the desk with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and the composed dignity of a boy who had made his decision days ago and was now simply executing it. "He asked me to sign a statement," Samuel said, "saying that Margaret had neglected us, that she had left us alone for long periods, and that the workshop was dangerous for Ruth to be in." He paused. "He said if I signed it, Ruth and I could stay with him and he'd make sure we were educated properly. He said it was the honest thing to do for our sister's sake." "And you refused," Platt said. "3 times, Samuel said. "The 3rd time he told me I was a foolish boy who didn't understand what was good for him." Platt looked at Walter. Walter had the particular expression of a man watching the last calculation fail. "The guardianship petition," Platt said, "was funded by a third party with a financial interest in its outcome and was supported by attempted subornation of a minor witness." He wrote in his ledger, "Mr. Hale, I am going to ask you to remain available for a formal county hearing." "You can't." "I can," Platt said pleasantly. "And I am." Walter looked at Margaret. She looked back at him without heat, without triumph, without any of the anger. She had a right to, because anger at this stage would cost her something, and she had stopped spending things she couldn't afford. "I want the children home," she said to Platt. "Today." "Yes, ma'am," Platt said. "I believe that's appropriate." Ruth came back in the early afternoon, brought by one of Platt's men from Walter's house 2 miles away. She came through the front door of Mercer Hall with her small traveling bag clutched in both hands, and her face carefully composed in the way Margaret recognized as Ruth's version of holding herself together until she had determined whether holding together was still necessary. She looked at Margaret. She looked at Samuel. She looked at the hall around her, at Hattie hovering near the kitchen door, at Everett, who had allowed himself one small satisfied expression before resuming his professional neutrality, at Nathaniel, who was in the doorway of the library. Then, Ruth's face did what it had been preventing itself from doing since the night she had been taken to Walter's house, and she crossed the hall in 8 quick steps and put her arms around Margaret's waist and held on. Margaret held her back. She did not say, "It's all right," because it hadn't been, and Ruth was 9 and understood the difference. She said, "You're home," which was true, and Ruth nodded against her and held on for another long moment, and then pulled back and looked at Nathaniel with the directness she had always deployed on him. "They said Margaret poisoned you," Ruth said. "They were wrong," Nathaniel said. "I know they were wrong. I told Walter's housekeeper they were wrong, and she told me to mind my own business, and I told her it was my business." She paused. "Was she arrested?" "Not the housekeeper," Nathaniel said. He had the near smile expression. "But several other people were." Ruth considered this, and apparently found it satisfactory, because she went to find Samuel and left the adults to the rest of the afternoon's business. Silas Mercer was formally arrested at 2 o'clock for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of legal documents, financial theft from the Mercer estate, deliberate medical harm, and conspiracy in connection with the carriage incident, that last charge listed as suspected, pending the outcome of the formal investigation, because Platt was an honest man, and an honest man charged what he could prove and noted what he was still proving. Silas walked out the front door of Mercer Hall between 2 deputies with the same composed expression he had maintained most of the morning, and Margaret watched him go and thought about the particular exhaustion that follows the end of something that has been running too long. Dr. Crane was taken separately. He had the look of a man who had already begun the long process of living with himself which would take considerably longer than any formal proceeding. Jonathan stayed through the afternoon. He and Nathaniel spent 2 hours at the desk going through the most urgent estate matters accounts that needed immediate correction, contracts with Blue Ridge Trading that needed to be formally dissolved, mill workers who had been underpaid through the fraudulent invoicing and needed restitution calculated. It was practical and detailed and unglamorous work, the kind of work that actual repair requires. And Margaret sat at the other end of the desk and helped because she had managed accounts for 9 years and she could spot a discrepancy in an invoice faster than most men who did it for a living. Hattie brought coffee. Ruth fell asleep in the chair by the fireplace, her traveling bag still in her arms. Samuel began sketching something on the back of a blank invoice sheet, and Nathaniel noticed and asked what it was, and Samuel said it was a modified gear arrangement for the mill press, and Nathaniel said to bring it closer. And they spent 20 minutes on it, while Jonathan filed documents, and Margaret compared numbers, and the room was full of people doing the particular ordinary work of putting things back in order. At some point in the late afternoon, Nathaniel looked up from the desk and found Margaret watching him, not with any particular expression, just watching the way you watch something you have been afraid of losing and have not yet fully accepted is still there. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, so only she could hear, "Are you all right?" She thought about the east wing and the locked door and the 2 days of working a plan through a fireplace flue. She thought about the night he had said, "Tell me what city you're watching from." No, that was wrong. She was tired. She thought about the document she had burned on the first night, and every morning she had sat across from him while the tonic did its slow work, and she had written numbers in a journal and told herself that what she felt was strategic. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again tomorrow." He nodded. He went back to the contracts, but she noticed that his hand, when he reached for the next document, moved slightly closer to where she was sitting. Not touching, just closer. She did not mention it. She moved the ink bottle 2 inches to the left, so it was within his reach, without asking, and they continued working. Jonathan left at dusk. The deputies had gone. The house settled into its evening sounds, the cook finishing the kitchen, Everett checking the doors, the small distant voices of Ruth and Samuel from somewhere in the upper hall. Nathaniel was still at the desk. He was not working anymore. He was sitting with a single document in his hands, and when Margaret came back into the library from seeing Jonathan to the door, she could see from across the room what it was. It was the carriage repair invoice, Amos's duplicate, the one with the component specifications and the forged signature. She sat down across from him and waited. "I kept telling myself," he said finally, "that the accident was bad road and bad luck, that I was angry and looking for someone to blame, and that a man who invents reasons for his suffering, instead of accepting it, is a particular kind of weak." He looked at the paper. "I convinced myself that the voice I heard on the road was my memory filling in the silence, that needing someone to have done this to me was a failure of character." "Silas wanted you to think that," Margaret said. "He built it specifically. The isolation, the medicine, the way your own mind was made unreliable enough that you stopped trusting your own memories. I know that now." He set the invoice down. "It doesn't make it easier to understand that I spent 2 years apologizing to people for limitations that were not the injury." "No," she said. "I don't imagine it does." He looked at her. "I owe you something I don't have adequate words for." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "We made an agreement. We kept it." "Margaret." He said it with the particular weight he gave her name when he meant something underneath the words. "The agreement was that you would manage my household and represent me publicly. It did not include any clause about spending 6 weeks reconstructing the evidence of an attempted murder while confined to a wing of someone else's house." She almost smiled. "I was operating under the general principle that keeping you alive was included in the household management. That is an extremely broad interpretation of household management. I am an extremely thorough person." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look and did not look away because she had been honest with him since the first night, and she was not going to stop now. "There was a conversation," he said carefully, "that I asked you about through a fireplace, which is not how I would have preferred to conduct it." "No," she agreed. "I meant what I said. When this was finished. When the children were home and Silas was gone and the accounts were straight." He stopped. "I want to have that conversation. Not tonight. Tonight you need to sleep, and so do I, and neither of us is in any condition for a conversation that matters. But soon." Margaret looked at him. She thought about obligation, and about the specific difference between a feeling that grows in good conditions and a feeling that grows in difficulty, and about how you know the difference is that one of them survives the moment the difficulty ends. "Soon," she said. She stood and straightened the last of the documents on the desk and carried the ink bottle back to the sideboard. She stopped at the door. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. "You ran an investigation from a chair in your own house with a lawyer, a retired bookkeeper, a fireplace, and a 14-year-old who climbs out windows," she said. "I want you to sit with that for a moment before you go to sleep, because I think you are still running the calculation that says needing help makes a man diminished." She met his eyes. "Every person in this house today was here because you asked them to be. That is not helplessness. That is leadership." He was quiet. She left him with it and went upstairs to her room and sat at her writing table and opened her journal to a new page. And for the first time in 6 weeks, she did not write numbers or names or evidence chains or timelines. She sat with the pen in her hand and the blank page in front of her, and thought about a man who had said a witness who can say, "I still possess it," and had turned out to mean something considerably more than legal standing, and she wrote 2 words. "He does." Then she closed the journal and slept better than she had since the day she tore a legal notice in half on a courthouse step in the July heat, a woman refusing to break quietly, not yet knowing what or who she was refusing for. The weeks after Silas's arrest moved the way recovery always moves, not in a straight line, not with any particular drama, but in the accumulating small weight of ordinary days that are better than the ones before them. Nathaniel did not announce his rehabilitation. He did not make a project of it or invite observation. What he did was stop apologizing when he dropped something. Stop going silent when he needed assistance, transferring from the chair. Stop arranging his schedule around the avoidance of witnesses. Margaret noticed this, not because he told her, but because she had been watching him for 2 months with the particular attention of someone keeping accounts, and she knew the difference between a man managing his limitations and a man accepting them. The tonic was gone. Dr. Crane's green bottle had been removed from the library sideboard the afternoon of the arrest and had not returned, and the absence of it changed Nathaniel in ways that were still unfolding. His concentration held through full afternoons now. He read contracts without losing the thread. He remembered figures from one meeting to the next. He woke in the mornings without the specific fog she had watched him work through every day for weeks, and the version of him that existed in those clear hours was no longer only the early morning version. It was simply him present and sharp, and occasionally impatient in the way of a man who has things he wants to accomplish, and is measuring the distance between himself and them. How was also she understood quietly furious. Not at her, not at the household, not at anyone currently within reach. At 2 years. At the specific arithmetic of what 2 years of deliberate diminishment costs a person when they finally do the full accounting. She did not try to talk him out of it, because it was not something to be talked out of. It was something to be carried for a while, and then set down when he was ready, and she had enough respect for him to let him carry it without trying to take it before he was finished. What she did instead was work beside him. Every morning at the desk. Supply invoices, mill contracts, worker restitution calculations. Nathaniel was meticulous and fast, and occasionally surprised her with the depth of what he knew, not just the numbers, but the history behind them, which families had worked, which land for how many generations, which contracts had been built on handshakes that predated paper documentation, which debts were genuine, and which had been manufactured by Silas's shell companies. She brought the merchant's eye for patterns. He brought 12 years of knowing this particular county's bones. Together they moved through the estate's records with the efficient, slightly combative rhythm of 2 people who disagree productively and have stopped pretending otherwise. Samuel was at the desk with them more mornings than not. He had stopped asking permission after the 3rd day, simply appearing at the library door with his coffee and his surveying notebook. And neither Nathaniel nor Margaret told him to go elsewhere, because his questions were good ones, and his instincts about mechanical problems were occasionally better than either of theirs. Ruth read beside the fireplace and observed everything, and reported her observations to Margaret each evening with the editorial confidence of a 9-year-old who has decided she is a reliable journalist. She had opinions about the estate accounts, about which mill workers seemed trustworthy, about Everett's feelings on the matter of the West Office key, and about the precise nature of the situation between her sister and Nathaniel, which she had not shared aloud, but which her expression communicated with considerable clarity every time she watched them at the desk together. Chitam. The formal county hearing convened on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after the arrest. Margaret had not expected to feel anything particular about it. The evidence was organized. Jonathan had prepared 3 witnesses besides Amos Reed. Crane's testimony was confirmed in writing. The forged signature had been assessed by 2 independent document examiners, and both had reached the same conclusion. The case was not in question. What she had not anticipated was sitting in the county courthouse, the same building, the same county square, the same late summer heat, and watching Walter Hale attempt to argue that his financial relationship with Blue Ridge Trading had been a coincidence of business rather than a conspiracy, and feeling not triumph, but something closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a long task completed. The body acknowledging that it has been tense for a very long time and is now cautiously beginning to unknot. Walter's argument lasted approximately 40 minutes before the magistrate. A different magistrate from the one who had given Margaret 30 days in July. A woman having applied to be a magistrate before any such thing was possible in this county. So it was a man, but at least it was a man who had read the full evidentiary file before sitting down, stopped him, and asked Jonathan to present the banking records. After the banking records, Walter's attorney stopped trying to argue and began negotiating. The outcome was not a prison sentence for Walter. Margaret had not expected one, and would not have asked for one. What it was, the guardianship petition dissolved permanently. All claims against the Hale workshop abandoned a formal court record, establishing that Margaret Hale Mercer was and had always been a fit guardian for her siblings, and a financial penalty that would take Walter Hale a considerable number of years to satisfy, which was its own kind of consequence. She sat beside Nathaniel when the magistrate read the final determination and felt his hand move, not reaching for hers, not making a statement of it, just moving to the armrest of his chair that happened to be adjacent to her chair, close enough that when she exhaled and her arm relaxed, her elbow was against his. She left it there. He did not move it. Jonathan leaned across and said something quiet to Nathaniel about the estate restoration order, and Nathaniel nodded and said he'd review it tonight, and the proceedings continued. And Margaret sat in the county courthouse in the same Virginia summer heat that had nearly taken everything from her 8 weeks ago, and thought about how strange it was that the same circumstances that break something can sometimes, if you hold the pieces correctly, be the exact circumstances that make it into a different shape than you had before. Not better or worse necessarily. Different. More deliberate. More clearly chosen. Silas Mercer's case took longer. It would take longer still. These things always did when the charges were serious, and the accused had money enough for prolonged legal maneuvering. Jonathan told Nathaniel as much, and Nathaniel said he understood, and the expression on his face when he said it was the expression of a man who has stopped requiring a conclusion in order to move forward. That Margaret thought was perhaps the most significant change. The Nathaniel who had sat in that library on her first night offering her a pre-negotiated exit, and a document releasing both of them from expectation, that man had been building walls around a future he couldn't yet trust. This man was not building walls. He was building something else. She wasn't entirely certain what to call it yet, but she recognized the shape of it from the inside, because she had been building the same thing from her side without naming it either. The conversation he had asked for through the fireplace did not happen that first week or the second, not because they avoided it, but because there was always something practical that needed to be done first, and they were both in their different ways, people who did the practical thing first. She had always considered this a virtue. She was beginning to suspect it was also in certain circumstances a form of fear. It was Ruth who finally precipitated the end of the avoidance, as 9-year-olds will when they have assessed a situation and found the adult's management of it inadequate. She did it by asking Nathaniel at breakfast in her clear, direct voice whether he was going to stay married to Margaret. Nathaniel put down his coffee cup. Samuel looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who knew this was coming and had decided to let it happen rather than intervene. That, Nathaniel said carefully, is a question that has a more complicated answer than it might appear. Why? Ruth said. Because marriage involves two people, and I can only speak for one of them. Ruth turned to Margaret. Are you going to stay married to him? Margaret looked at her sister. She looked at Nathaniel, who was watching her with the controlled expression he used when something mattered enough that he was being careful with his face. She looked at Samuel, who had stopped pretending to study the ceiling. Ruth, she said, that is a conversation I am going to have with Nathaniel directly. When? Soon. Ruth looked between them with the evaluating expression of a very small magistrate. You've been saying soon for 2 weeks. Have I? You have. Samuel counted. Samuel said without looking up from the ceiling. I counted. That evening, Nathaniel asked her to meet him in the East Assembly Room. She had not been in that room before. It was large and largely empty, used in previous years for county gatherings and estate meetings, now cleared of most of its furniture. Along the far wall was a set of wooden parallel rails, floor to ceiling. Installed recently, she could see the new lumber, the fresh planing at a height and spacing that she understood immediately. Rehabilitation rails. The kind a man uses when he is learning or relearning to put weight through legs that have been made deliberately unreliable for 2 years and are now slowly being asked to remember what they were capable of. Nathaniel was beside the rails when she came in. He was not using them. He was waiting, and he had a document in his hands that he held out to her when she reached him. She took it. She read it. It was a legal document prepared by Jonathan, properly witnessed. It transferred no money and imposed no obligation. What it stated in the careful, dry language of legal documentation was that Margaret Hale Mercer retained permanent legal guardianship of Samuel and Ruth Hale, that the Hale workshop was exclusively Hale property in perpetuity, and that she retained the right to dissolve the marriage with her full financial independence intact and her family's situation entirely protected. She read it twice. She looked up. You had Jonathan prepare this, she said. 2 days ago. Why? Nathaniel looked at her steadily. Because the reason you entered this marriage was to protect your family. They are protected now legally and permanently, regardless of any other outcome. I wanted you to have this document in your hands before I said anything else to you. He paused. I did not want you to wonder afterward whether what you felt was gratitude or obligation or the weight of a situation you couldn't see a way out of. I wanted the way out to be in your hands first. She looked at the document. She thought about the first document he had given her the night after their wedding, the one she had put in the fireplace. She understood that he had not forgotten that this document was in some sense an answer to what she had done with the first one. He was giving her the exit again, but this time not as a preemptive apology, as a genuine offering, as the thing that made everything after it freely chosen. She folded the document carefully in half. She looked around for a fireplace and found there was none in this room. She held the document out to him. Keep it, she said, in the desk, in case I ever need to show someone the legal framework. She met his eyes. I'm not burning this one because it's useful documentation. But I'm also not leaving Nathaniel. Not because of gratitude. Not because of the arrangement. Not because Ruth would have things to say about it. Something moved in his face. Then why? Because I want to stay, she said. Which I recognize is not a very elaborate declaration, but I have found that the simple version is usually the one that's true. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document in her outstretched hand. He did not take it immediately. There's something I need to say first, he said. Something I have been not saying for several weeks because I was not certain you would believe it wasn't circumstance talking. Say it. My former fiancée, the woman who left after the accident, told me that a woman could care for a man in my situation, but could not desire him. That the most I could hope for was a compassionate form of obligation. He looked at her. I believed her, not because she was right, but because I was in enough pain that I needed an explanation for why she was leaving, and that explanation fit the available space. He stopped. I have spent 2 years building a life around that belief. Offering exits before entrances. Negotiating release before I allowed connection. Treating every kindness as something that needed to be formally refused so that no one would feel trapped by it. She did not say anything. She waited. You burned the first document, he said. And then you sat with me in a storm. And then you kept a journal of my symptoms. And then you talked to me through a fireplace. And then you walked into a room where I had no legal standing to override anything, and told a man who was threatening to have you confined. That responsibility was the reason you had learned not to surrender. He paused. I have tried at each of those moments to believe that what I felt was gratitude. Appreciation for a competent partner. Respect for a woman of unusual character. And, she said, and I am no longer able to sustain that interpretation, he said, with any intellectual honesty. She almost smiled. It was such a precise, careful, characteristically Nathaniel way to say the thing, as though he were presenting evidence and allowing her to reach the conclusion. Are you telling me, she said, that you love me, or are you telling me that you have eliminated all alternative explanations? Both, he said, in that order. She looked at him. He was watching her with the open expression she had first seen on a morning before the tonic, when his face had not yet been arranged into the controlled distance he used for protection, and she understood that what she was seeing was him without the armor. Not performing openness. Actually open. The way a person is when they have decided the risk is worth the cost. She took a breath. I memorized your symptoms, she said, because I was afraid for you. I sat with you in the storm because I couldn't make myself go upstairs. I talked to you through a fireplace because your voice was the thing that made the 2 days in that wing manageable. She paused. I have been telling myself those were strategic decisions for approximately 6 weeks, and I have not once believed myself. He was very still. I love you, she said simply because the simple version was the true one. Not the arrangement, not the estate, not the situation. You. The man who paid injured workers when they couldn't work and kept tenants' children in school and remembered every servant's family member's name and ran an investigation from his chair with a lawyer and a retired bookkeeper and my 14-year-old brother. She held his gaze. I love the man who asked me to stay not because the arrangement required it, but because he wanted me to. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face changed, not dramatically. Not the way things change in stories. When a door opens dramatically onto a new scene, but the way things change in real life, which is slowly and completely, and in a way that can't be undone. He reached out and took her hand, not urgently, not with the grasping quality of someone afraid of losing a thing. Carefully, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. When she told me, he said quietly, that a woman could care but not desire. I want to know, do you think she was wrong? She looked at him, at the scars near his temple, at the chair he had lived in for 2 years and would likely live in for years more, at the hands that had shaken from medicine he didn't know was poison and were steady now and warm around hers. I think, Margaret said, that she was describing herself and calling it a universal truth, which is a thing frightened people do. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the gesture was so deliberate and so quiet that it was more intimate than something louder would have been. She felt it through her whole chest. Stay with me, he said, against her hand. Not because you must, because you want to. I already answered that question, she said. I know, I want to hear it again. I want to stay, she said. I want to stay, Nathaniel. Then he did something she had not expected. He put his hands on the wheels of his chair and moved toward the parallel rails along the wall, and she understood he wanted to show her something. She followed without asking what it was, because she had learned that he communicated certain things through action rather than announcement, and this was one of those things. He positioned himself at the end of the rails. He placed both hands on the bars. She watched him breathe in and then push, not dramatically, not with a great visible effort, but with the measured, focused pressure of a man who has been doing this in private for weeks and knows exactly what his body will and won't do in response. He came upright, slowly. His legs shook. She could see the effort in his shoulders and the set of his jaw, but his face was not anguished. It was concentrated in the way of a person doing something difficult that they have decided to do. He stood. Between the rails with his hands on the bars, his weight unsteady, and his legs not fully supporting him, he stood. She did not applaud. She did not exclaim. She understood that what he was showing her was not a miracle, and he was not presenting it as one. He was showing her where he actually was. The real number. Not the inflated figure of a man pretending to more capacity than he had, not the deflated figure of a man made smaller than he was by 2 years of careful diminishment. The actual honest accounting. He took one step. The rails took most of his weight. His right leg moved forward and his left followed with a visible effort, and he breathed through it with his jaw set and his eyes on the end of the rails. Second step. Slower. She could see him calculating how much was left. Third step. His right hand gripped the rail hard. His breathing changed. He stopped. He did not try for a fourth step. He knew as she was beginning to understand, he had always known what his actual limits were, that the fourth step was not today's. He stood for a moment between the rails, 3 steps from where he had started, more than she had seen him do before, less than he might do someday. And then he lowered himself back into the chair, with the controlled, practiced movement of a man who has accepted that sitting down is not the end of anything. He looked at her. 3, he said. 3, she agreed. Last week, it was 1. I know. She sat down in a... Someone had placed near the rails Everett, she thought, who seemed to know what was needed in any room before it was needed. Samuel told me. He's been counting. Nathaniel looked at her. He's been watching. From the doorway. He thinks you don't know. Something crossed his face, not quite the near smile, but its first cousin. I know. He told Ruth it's the most impressive thing he's ever seen, Margaret said. And Samuel does not give compliments easily. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb this, the particular way a person absorbs being seen clearly by someone they have come to love, the slight unsteadiness of it, the involuntary reaching toward. I may always need the chair, he said. You understand that. I have understood that since the second day, she said. It has not altered any calculation I've made. I know. He looked at his hands on the wheels. I am still learning to understand it myself. That the chair is... He stopped. That it is not the opposite of the man. That it is simply part of how the man moves through the world. Yes, she said. Your former opinion of men in chairs, he said with a careful lightness that was also a real question, was formed before you knew any. My current opinion of men in chairs, she said, was formed entirely by knowing one. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he offered her his hand, not to be helped, not needing anything from her in that moment, except what it was, a hand offered because he wanted to offer it, and she took it, and they sat like that in the assembly room, while the September light came through the windows at the long slanted angle of afternoon, moving toward evening. Neither of them speaking, because some things have already been said and do not need repetition. Samuel found the old violin in the third-floor storage room 3 days later and brought it down without fanfare, and began playing it in the evenings after supper, working his way through simple tunes with the methodical patience he applied to everything he decided was worth learning. How was not good yet. He was going to be good eventually. That was the thing about Samuel. He was almost never good at something immediately, but he was almost always good at it eventually, because he approached learning the way Margaret approached accounts systematically without ego, willing to be wrong as many times as necessary before he was right. How was playing something slow and not entirely accurate in the main hall. One evening when Ruth pulled Margaret to the doorway of the assembly room, where Nathaniel had been working late at the desk, Jonathan had moved in for him, and Ruth said simply, "Dance with him." Margaret looked at her. "Ruth, I'm not asking you to lift him," Ruth said, with the specific patience of a 9-year-old who has thought this through. "I'm asking you to stand next to him while he moves his chair. That is a dance. I looked it up." "Where did you look it up?" "I asked Everett, and Everett said that in the old sense, a dance just means two people moving through the same space together with intention. Ruth looked at her steadily. That is what you do every morning at the desk. Margaret looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she went into the assembly room. Nathaniel looked up when she came in. He had his working expression, the one that meant he was 3/4 through something and calculating whether he could finish it tonight. He saw her face and set down his pen. Samuel is playing in the hall, Margaret said. I heard. Ruth wants us to dance. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Did she explain what she means by dance? She said two people moving through the same space together with intention. She asked Everett. He looked at her for another moment. Then he put the cap on the ink bottle and set it aside, and he put his hands on the wheels, and he looked at her with the open expression that was just him unhidden and said, Then let's not disappoint Everett. She laughed. She had not known she was going to, and the sound of it surprised her, and she saw it surprise him too. Not unpleasantly, the way a sound surprises you when it's something you have been wanting to hear and weren't expecting in that moment. She walked beside him into the hall. Samuel was at the far end, focused on his violin, not watching them. Ruth was watching them with the expression of a theatrical director who has staged something and is monitoring the execution. Everett was somewhere in the direction of the kitchen and had the good grace to stay there. The tune Samuel was playing was slow and imperfect and entirely right. Margaret walked beside Nathaniel's chair, and he moved the wheels. And sometimes she stepped forward, and sometimes she stepped around him, and sometimes they stopped for a moment to let him adjust his grip, and then continued. And there was nothing grand about it, nothing that would be called a dance by anyone who had not heard Everett's definition. Just two people moving through the same space together with intention. Her hand on his shoulder for a moment, then released. His pace, then hers, then found together again. Ruth made no sound. Samuel kept playing. The hall was warm, and the light was low, and everything that had nearly been destroyed. The children, the estate, the man in the chair. The woman who had torn a legal notice in half and refused to break quietly was here intact in this ordinary evening. Nathaniel stopped the chair and looked at her, and what was on his face was not the performance of happiness or the relief of crisis. Ended, but something quieter and more permanent than either the particular expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they intend to remain. Margaret, he said. She looked at him. Will you stay? He said, not because the documents say so, and not because the arrangement requires it, and not because you are the kind of woman who does not leave a thing unfinished. He held her gaze. Will you stay because this is the life you choose? She had already answered this question twice. She understood he was not asking because he had forgotten. He was asking because some things need to be said in the open, in the light in front of the people you are saying them in front of, without the fireplace and the locked wing, and the urgency of a plan that needed to move faster than the people trying to stop it. He was asking because he wanted the answer to exist in an ordinary moment where ordinary moments live. She put her hand on his. I chose it, she said, long before either of us had the courage to say so. Samuel's tune drifted to its imperfect, unhurried end. Ruth in the corner exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for approximately 6 weeks, which she had. Outside the last of the September light, let go of the day, and the Virginia evening settled in warm, still the heat of summer, not yet fully surrendered to the coming of autumn. Somewhere on the estate the mill turned. Somewhere in the county, a courthouse held the records of a conspiracy dismantled and a family restored. Somewhere in the past, a woman had stood on a courthouse step with a torn legal notice in her hand and made a decision she had not yet understood the full shape of. She understood it now. Strength was not refusing help. It was trusting someone enough to share the weight. Love was not the reward waiting after hardship. It was what you found yourself doing in the middle of it before you had decided to. And a marriage that begins as a legal arrangement between two people who expect nothing from each other can become, if both people are honest, and neither one breaks quietly, and both of them choose the same direction. Every morning can become the most freely chosen thing either of them has ever done. Nathaniel guided his chair forward. Margaret walked beside him. They moved together through the warm, imperfect, entirely sufficient